Welcome everyone to First Principles Podcast, the podcast that is dedicated to covering all subjects that are related to environmental issues and breaking them down from first principles, of course. Today we are going to be focusing on, what are we focusing on, Elliott? You want to remind me real quick?
Eco-anxiety.
Eco-anxiety. Now, this is a topic that we touched on briefly in a previous podcast of ours that is unreleased, but if it is released by the time that we release this, we'll add a link to it that touches on it briefly. But anyways, eco-anxiety, that's a term that's been coined recently. I believe it was as early as 2017. It is an anxiety that people feel towards the impending environmental catastrophes that we are constantly being told are among us, that are about to happen via our media, via our politics. There's a lot of kind of in recent times anyways, there's been more of a focus on kind of the impending doom element of things. And I think that might be one of the biggest contributors to this whole feeling that's been traversing the culture as a whole. But before we jump into things, I don't know, what are your thoughts on this, Elliott, before we get too deep?
Yeah. One thing I should say off the bat is that eco anxiety, the term came about recently, 2017, around there. But I mean, this feeling of anxiety towards the environment and the potential doom associated with it. It's been around longer than that for sure, and it's, I think, maybe heightened in recent years because the narrative around it has become mainstream. Well, at least the doom and gloom part of it, in many ways, has become mainstream, and there's a lot more younger people hearing this message and freaking out a little bit, rightly so. And it's not just young people; it's all ages are suffering at times from eco-anxiety. But I thought it was interesting that psychologists, or at least some experts, think that eco-anxiety is a healthy reaction to the information we're being told about environmental, catastrophes that are coming, and that
You don't think that's the case?
No, I think that's. That makes sense because, as they put it, it's something. This environmental catastrophe is something that is, threatening our existence. It's an existential threat, and if we weren't to get anxious about that, what's driving us then become the question. I think it is problematic if anxiety is, just the way you feel, like it is the way you. The negative feelings you're getting from it, but if it can be used as a positive force, which we'll talk about a little later, like ways you can use those feelings of anxiety and channel them to do productive things, then you can alleviate some of the negative feelings of anxiety.
Yeah, I think really we did a bit of a survey of just some journals, some newspaper articles, some magazines that are talking about it, and just some of the advice also from YouTube videos and whatever. We amalgamated a bunch of information that we read about the subject, and a lot of the advice, really was focused on taking control of things in the sense of what can you do specifically to control this subject, and what can you take in your own hands so that you can do, and not necessarily always be worried and anxious about what everybody else is doing, because at the end of the day we can only control our own actions, and we can only control what we are capable of. We can always worry and wonder why isn't somebody doing X when Y is a huge issue. why isn't everybody using non-plastic straws when we know that that's a big issue, right? Plastics, single-use plastics or whatever. Somebody might have that type of thought, but at the same time, again, it comes down to what can you do as an individual, which I think is, a good takeaway. Despite the fact that there's a bunch of negative stuff that's coming out of it into and permeating into the culture and into the minds of the youth. I think the notion that we can empower ourselves by taking action from as an individual, I think then that's a good thing that can potentially come out of this thing.
Absolutely. I think that like anybody who feels that the information they're hearing about environmental issues, climate change, has a large amount of uncertainty associated with it, you're absolutely right. And I think as humans, we don't deal well with uncertainty. Like you were pointing to before, we crave control, and that's why sometimes we think we get into these problems where we want to control other people, other people's actions. We don't understand that. But it's very good to adopt the philosophy that you are not in control of anybody else but yourself. And it is through your own actions that you can do the greatest good for your own sanity and for the world, I think, when you take the time to reflect on your own actions and see what you can do better going forward. And this is this is different for every individual. I think that but first you need to define what it is that's getting you anxious and look at the way which best suits you that you can act on these topics that are making you anxious. Some people choose activism, getting out on the street and in different forms. For other people, being out there protesting is not what is going to be best for them. What might be best for them is talking about it with their friends. That's like what was important to them in terms of like what they think what kind of changes they can make in their lifestyle that will reflect the way they would want to live and the world they want to see in the future. Because just any small steps that you can start making today, tomorrow, can have profound, implications on the future.
Well, okay. I mean, I guess ultimately, all that to say, there are some good things that have come out of it where, it's leading back to people towards the notion of taking control of their own lives and not feeling completely powerless, because I guess that's the main issue that people are having, is that it's this eco-anxiety is part of it is caused by a sense of powerlessness from the potential impending doom from our environmental crises that are upon us. And because the implications are so grave, we feel powerless. But then the whole question is, can the individual have the power to make a change? I believe yes. I believe that there is good, a net benefit that each one of us can try to put forward, and then that accumulates and compounds and sums among all of us.
Snowballs.
It snowballs, definitely, right? You have to be the change that you seek, right? It's some cliche shit, but I think there is some wisdom to that. But considering all the potential good things that can come out of it, I just want to touch on real quick, like what are some of the more so weird or whack parts of eco-anxiety. Like, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff that we read that was kind of, I don't know, for me anyways, it was a bit like, let's look at some of the things that we looked at from, what was it, the Washington Post? No, the Guardian. So they had an article on eco-anxiety, and one of the topics that they touched on was jet anxiety. And it was essentially talking about how Swedes had decreased the amount of time that they spent traveling due to a collective guilt that is, I guess, permeating through their society, where they feel bad for spending energy traveling via fuels, because of course, aviation, transportation, that's one of the or it's a potentially very large source of greenhouse gases because you're burning fuels in the atmospheres, all that kind of stuff. But it's just kind of like, should people feel bad about being able to travel and see the world? I mean, in a sense, I mean, something I just thought of right now. Well, we all know the great story of Steve Jobs and how he traveled to some temples in Southeast Asia when he was first, some Buddhist temples, I should say, when he was first on his journey to start Apple, right? I don't know if you heard about that, but yeah, he spent like a year or so. I forget what the exact time frame was, but in his early stages of developing Apple, he took some time off. He traveled to some countries in Southeast Asia. I forget which one specifically, but he essentially kind of took a what's the word? A pause kind of from life. He just wanted to explore things, his motivations, that type of stuff, and live by Buddhist practices, daily traditions. And through that, he was able to somehow come to the idea of Apple and developing that company, or he's attributed that part of his life strongly to his development of Apple. Now, I mean, can we say that airline travel has negative impacts in terms of the fuel that is spent? Okay, sure, yeah, fuel is burned, it generates carbon dioxide and stuff. But when you look at some anecdotal stories such as that, right? Like this travel that this man took was so instrumental in his life that it is one of the things that he's attributed greatly to the success and the founding principles that Apple was built on, which is now one of the most wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, company and beloved company in the world. So it's like, okay, maybe if Steve Jobs had felt guilty about traveling across the globe on a plane to Southeast Asia or whatever to gain certain perspective and enlightenment on the world, then maybe we wouldn't have had Apple nowadays, which, for some people, maybe that would have been a good thing, for all the Apple naysayers. But
it would be a very different world, though.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think that another perspective to consider when you hear from these articles that nitpick certain sectors or certain technologies is that you got to look at the perspective of how much is this company sector actually contributing to the overall CO2 emissions that are happening, right? So if you just simply look at the United States, transportation, the emissions from transportation of greenhouse gases only makes up about 30% of their sectors, 30% of all emissions, right? And then of that, in that transportation subfraction, it's divided into cars, trains, planes. They're all subdivided, right? So it seems very hypocritical to point fingers at one specific area because, granted, jet planes, emit more CO2 per trip probably than a car would, but that is absolutely no reason to create, in my opinion, social basically pressure or in the form of shaming people to avoid using airplanes. You pointed out the fact that you're really potentially limiting people from discovering incredible things if you are limiting their travel. I mean,
let's take that real quick. Sorry to cut you off.
Sure.
I just had this idea in my head. But what if we were to take that to its like extreme, like logical conclusion, where it's like, okay, well, taking the bus, that requires carbon fuel to be spent. Taking your car, that's carbon fuel to be spent. Taking the airplane, that requires carbon fuel to be spent. So then what's the logical conclusion? That therefore do not take any of those vehicles and just lock yourself up in your home and
Get a horse and buggy.
Get a horse and buggy.
Not even that, because they,
they fart.
They fart
and leave doo doo on the ground. So that's also emissions, I guess. So it's like, just don't do anything just because there's environmental emissions associated with it. I mean, that's kind of like a extreme of it, but yeah.
However, I think there is something to be said to utilize tools the best you can. So people, and I hear this at the company I work for, talk about do you really need to do a face-to-face meeting if it requires a bunch of travel for business or whatever? Can you get away with doing a Skype meeting? Can you get away with doing a conference call? These are ways, you have to judge the merit and value of making a trip versus using technologies like FaceTime and Skype to do these type of meetings. I think that's smart, and I think that's important to get out there too. Is like, maybe all the travel that we do is definitely not needed. Why are we commuting every single day into work if you have a job that you can do from your home? I think too many employers, this may get off topic, but don't take advantage of fostering, a work environment that allows that, and trusting that they have employees that are not going to, abuse that power. But I think, like, if you had more companies relying on their employers, like we live in Ottawa, Ontario, which is a government city, and there's notice when there's a government holiday how lean the traffic is, right?
Yeah.
So
easy, smooth driving, no problem.
So nice. You just
no traffic jams.
Something that might take you, 40 minutes on a regular day with traffic takes you 15 minutes. It's huge time, and
Double.
And a lot more missions you get from stop and go, and that happens with high traffic. Anyway, all this point being is, having known a ton of people that work in government, a lot of jobs are desk jobs that you spend most of your 8-hour day in front of a computer, and that really can be done from home for a lot of people.
And I think that's a great example of how technology is actually going to be one of the things that's going to help us get over this issue, is by solving these types of problems, such as, allowing workers to be able to do what they would normally do at the office, but from their home, right? So now you're saving on those transportation emissions from the transport of you from your home, your dwelling, into your office building, right? Or what you were saying before, again, there's so many examples of how technology is ultimately what's going to help us alleviate and kind of get through these issues. But I feel like a lot of what's being pushed out with this eco-anxiety thing is like, technology is bad. Like, progress is bad. That's actually what's leading to these issues. It's progress, it's capitalism. That's what's driving these issues. And maybe there's a certain kernel of truth in that, right? We do need resources to develop our products, but in a sense, technology, again, that is what is going to help us out. Like you mentioned, being able to work from home as opposed to spending those carbon emissions driving. What else could we say? Just better fuel efficiency when it comes to the actual combustion process, and how efficiently do we convert our fuel into carbon dioxide emissions. It's technology that is coming to the rescue, and then oftentimes we get the message of the opposite, of abandoning your technology and the message is often directed through the technology itself, which is kind of hypocritical in a sense. But it's leading to other talks of, like, for example, should you be eco-anxious about bringing kids into this world, right? The eco-anxiety is actually impacting people to the point of not wanting to have kids because of the logic of, why would I want to, bring kids into such a world that is doomed? Or there was like another Swedish study that we read about that was saying how reducing the number of children that you have in your family will reduce your carbon footprint by however X amount, whatever it was. Which, okay, again, there might be some kernel of truth to that, but what if that person that you chose not to be born, what if that person was going to actually contribute to the collective knowledge and the collective base of the the technology that's driving the advancement of our performance and the advancement of our environmental technology? So all that to say that what if by having more people, we're actually increasing the brain power that's necessary in order to look at these problems and actually solve them, right? Because what do we need to solve problems? We need brain power. We need computational power. And AI, as great, is coming a long way, but we still need human brain power, computational power to solve issues, right? For example, the Manhattan Project, the nuclear construction back in the 1940s, which led to the bombing of Japan at the end of World War II. That took many, many engineers, that took many, many scientists, that took a whole city of people in order to come together and develop technology that would take us to the next leap. And similarly, in this context, we also need the technology to come together, which ultimately comes from the people. And the people is what leads to the computational and the brain power. So the more brain power, the more computational power, more chance of coming to a solution to the problem. So again, who's to say that more kids, even though when we look at the carbon footprint per kid, okay, maybe you're emitting more carbon per kid, but who's to say that adding more brain power to solving this issue might not actually lead to some sort of solution? You know, I think that's kind of like a different angle on things. It's a very different angle on things that really provides like a countering view of this whole notion that we should give up having kids because kids are actually, or more people in this world, it just means more strain on resources, which just means more demand on the earth, which means the earth dies sooner. I don't know. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think that there's many reasons why people choose to have kids or don't choose to have kids. But to the point of not choosing to have kids because you think the future is doomed, you made a good argument there for why you should. There's like some optimism. There's why is it potentially good to have more population, which is a very interesting perspective, and I think it's a valid one that I hadn't considered. But I would like to first talk about people criticizing technology as being the part of the problem, and I think that some of that comes from the history of progress, which is something like the Industrial Revolution, which was a heavy emitter of
dirty.
CO2. It was dirty.
It was hell dirty.
It was really dirty, but it was a necessary step in this progress to more advanced technologies that have way surpassed coal and everything else that was being used in those initial steps. So we're talking about development here, and you have to consider development go through these peaks and valleys, but what we seem to be seeing based off our most recent history, because this is all very new, this technology advancements within the last 100 years is insane. But what we kind of see is, now we're reaping the benefits of technology in many ways. Like, we are way better off. And I think that's what's lost on a lot of people that think that when they think the world's fucked is they think that everything we are doing now is making things worse in some regard, or many things are.
It's all going downhill.
But we actually, this is one of the better times to live in many ways because of the advancements in technology. Now, no, yeah.
Like, honestly, like, if you wanted to have kids, like, now would be the best time ever. If you think about it in global historical terms, we won't get into those types of statistics, but it's just like we're living, in a totally new era where we have access to clean water, clean medicine. Clean what, sorry?
Sorry, not clean. I was gonna say medicine.
Clean water, medicine, like at our demand, at our disposal, and so we won't get into that argument though. Anyways, in terms of is it a good time or not compared to other times, but.
and I don't know, this deserves perhaps a podcast up for itself, but the whole idea about population getting out of hand and causing lots of issues. There's some really interesting, trends that we're now seeing. It's not the petri dish exponential growth that was being clouted by people, over the last 20 years. That's going to be the ruin of us. We're seeing that population has changed in developed countries drastically. It's actually not going exponentially anymore, and there are multiple factors which, again, we should donate another podcast to this, but of reasons why that is, changes in culture and changes in gender identity and stuff like that but all that to say is that the idea that we're on this runaway, we're in a time where we have this runaway reactor, and the cause of it is overpopulation. That simply isn't the case anymore, and I think that goes hand in hand with those people that are thinking about not having kids, is they think that they're contributing to this, catastrophe by having a kid. I'd caution people who think that way and just say you should look at some of the latest trends and studies. Like this is not projections. This is just looking at what is actually happening now with babies born to adults and stuff in different countries, and you'll see quite an interesting picture unfold, I think.
So you're saying that there's you're just pointing out to the fact that there's been a decrease in the birth rate in Western countries? Is that what you're
in developed countries?
Developed countries,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was. I mean, I thought for the longest time everybody thought, or was like, when you were predicting population growth, you looked at like an exponential model in a lot of cases, but that just simply isn't the case. And part of the reason is technology has created like clean water, better medicine, so people aren't. There was not always a conscious decision by families to have lots of kids because they knew they were going to lose some, but that was just the reality. People had bigger families, and they thought that it was common to lose some kids because of
reality.
And that simply, or at least that is not the case in many parts of the world anymore. Mm-hmm. Anyways, what else did you want to talk about in terms of eco-anxiety?
Mm-hmm. So I guess we talked about just briefly how, some of the solutions associated with dealing with eco-anxiety, because, fundamentally what is eco-anxiety? It's just, anxiety. It's another form of anxiety which people deal with. People have been dealing with anxiety as a form of, our evolution, I guess, in a sense, and it's just manifesting itself in a different form compared to before, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess the idea is fundamentally, what can we do? So we looked at, again, what is the solution to eco-anxiety? Taking control of what you can do as an individual, right? And then we looked at some of the criticisms of eco-anxiety. Well, you're getting to a point where people are being very hesitant to even take flights just because they're worried about their carbon footprint. And maybe that's valid, honestly. Maybe that's a valid point. But at the same time, should you be reducing your capacity to learn about the world and learn about new cultures, learn about new ways of doing things, which could potentially give you solutions to your previous problems? Again, going back to the Steve Jobs example, where he learned a lot about Apple via his travels across the oceans into Southeast Asia and adopting Buddhist cultures. And then I guess the question might be, is there something else that could be done for eco-anxiety? Is there something else that people can do in order to, or maybe could we go in a bit more in depth? I don't know, because we talked about, can we take things into our own hands? But okay, what can we do? What can we do and take into our own hands. Maybe we could go a bit more in depth on that. Like, what are certain things that people can do in order to take things in their own hands? Or is that almost like a separate podcast of its own? Or we want to talk about, okay, you said it's great. Okay, take action, take individual responsibility and do what you can. But some people might be asking, okay, what are those things? What are those things that an individual could do in order to take hold of their eco-anxiety and do something towards it? Again, bearing in mind that only their actions are the ones that they can control.
Yeah. I think, without getting into specifics, we did touch on some of the things that people can do to take back control. And we talked about, you being protesting, speaking up, finding groups of people to talk about your anxiety, making small changes to your lifestyle, which could, we definitely could go into what those changes in your lifestyle you could adopt some helpful ones in another podcast perhaps. But I think that what we should focus on in this episode is, what we're trying to focus on in this episode is just in a broad sense, what the eco-anxiety, I think, is okay. I think at this point is it's okay to feel these feelings. A lot of people are feeling them. That's what also you should know if you are someone who suffers from eco-anxiety. We were talking about this a bit earlier, but we are, about our own dealings with eco-anxiety. We haven't had it manifest in any large way in our lives, but we, I think, found that there were certain forms of it that definitely influence some of our decisions.
Yeah.
Did you want to speak to any your own personal experiences with eco-anxiety that you may have had?
I mean, yeah, I guess just speaking a bit about that, I mean, I think it's just inevitable to feel some sense of helplessness and hopelessness when it comes to issues that are that big, and I've definitely felt that way myself. And I guess, again, it just comes down to just asking yourself the question, okay, like, if this is a problem that I've seen, what can I now do to actually address it and try to help ameliorate and make it better? And maybe that was one of my decisions for studying what I studied in my undergraduate degree, which was focused on environmental engineering. Maybe that's the same case for you too, Elliott, where we wanted to take control and look into this issue. Okay, what's the whole deal with environmental pollution? What can we do in terms of technology, in terms of engineering, in terms of our scientific accumulated knowledge on the subject? And how can I learn from this body of knowledge that's trying to tackle this really massive problem? And then how can I contribute to this body of knowledge and take from it and use it in order to, again, solve this issue or contribute to some small section of it?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that in doing that, in trying to contribute, you feel an alleviation of the anxiety in some ways. The other thing I wanted to touch on, which is a thought that I sometimes have when you talk about the philosophy of basically taking actions into your own hands and realizing you are you are the master of your own actions, and you can't control other people, is you can adopt these practices in your life and run into the issue where you might still feel like perhaps angry or bitter about the lack of action you see of others around you. That is, I think, a real thing that some people who practice this philosophy run into. And I don't know if you have any answers towards that if you do ever run into those feelings. But I mean, for me, I think that the focus when you do think about like others and their actions that are counterproductive to yours is real. I mean, I think you got to realize, and this is the hardest part, is you know, you can't control them. You can't control their people. But that doesn't make what you're doing less significant. I think that we talked about the snowball effect. I think eventually that if you stick to your positive, your guns and continue those practices without, compromise, then you will almost always reap benefit from that in some regards. It may come off a bit vague, but do you ever run into those feelings of, being frustrated by other people and their inaction in some regards to topics that are important to you?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Many times you can look at somebody else and maybe there's a subject that you're really passionate about, and for somebody else they're very apathetic towards it and they don't really care, and maybe everything that you're doing towards ameliorating that subject, they're doing everything in their hands to counter what you're doing. So
Yeah.
but again, in those moments, I think in those moments of frustration that are inevitably going to come up, and it's just like a fact of life that you're never always going to have 100% agreement with your cause, with your movement, with your values, right? Not everybody's always going to align themselves with their values with their values towards yours, all that to say. But at the end of the day, again, like, it really just comes down to focusing on the task at hand, not worrying about what other people are doing, because again, that's just fundamentally a rabbit hole that never ends. Because if you're just going to continuously look at what other people are doing, you're always going to have some level of frustration, and there's always going to be something that somebody's doing that doesn't quite jive with your own morals and values and ethics and whatever. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, that's a never-ending rabbit hole. You could lose yourself forever, and many people do, and they never come out of it, and that's how you have a lot of people going through depression, whatever. Well, that's not, don't want to say that's the only reason, but that could be one thing that contributes to it anyways. But it, again, like, it's hard to really put it in any different kind of way, but it really comes from a knowledge that you are only the master of your world. You are not an authoritarian. You are not a king. You are not a dictator that's going to change how other people are living their lives. Okay, fact number one. So if that's the case, that you cannot control the other people's lives, then what is your option? Well, your option could be to either join in the apathy, join in the lack of caring of the subject, and yourself losing interest and becoming disinterested in it, or you could simply acknowledge again that the world is structured such that people are infinitely different and they will have infinitely different values, and accepting that fact that what's valuable to you is not valuable to someone else, maybe many other people, but there's typically some small group, some small subset of people to whom what your values are will jive with. And trying to, I think, surround yourself in that community, I think that is a big step. So we talked about individual steps that you can take, but then also I think developing the community around you is important as well. So it's a bit of a balance there. And all the talk about, not worrying about the people doesn't mean to be apathetic towards them. Maybe we still need to have the community that encourages us so that we stay on the path and continue to grow and tackle the issue. But at the end of the day, we have to realize that it's our own individual actions that are going to take us to the level where we are in line, where our actions are in line with our internal values. Our external actions are in line with our internal values. And I think a community of like-minded people can go a long way towards that. But at the end of the day, you also need your own individual self-drive. And again, just the self-awareness and knowledge that people are infinitely different. And as a result, you're going to find those people that are apathetic towards your cause. And that is life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Man, this is really taking a philosophical twist to it, this episode, for sure.
For
but
real.
I think it was important that we talked about those different angles.
Yes.
I mean, I think one other thing I wanted to toss in here, and we didn't talk about, but I feel like it wouldn't be complete without, is, talking about, you're talking about community, right? What are the benefits of having a community that shares your values? Is that when you have those down moments, you're around people that you can feed off of, and in the form of, and this is what's so important about this, is that you surround people with positive people that are represent your values and respect them. Is that you will be more likely to course correct when you are heading in a negative direction when you're around those people than you would be if you were around people that are don't have your best interests in mind, or share different values, or you're just by yourself. That's harder to course correct when you it's harder to course correct, pardon me, when you don't have a community around you that can help you with that.
Yeah, for real, because when your friends, your true friends, if they're real friends, or people that really care about your cause and are really devoted to the cause, if they see you veering off the path, then they will speak up and they will tell you that, hey, you know what? Your actions right now, they're not in line with your values and you need to change something up. And they will be willing to have that uncomfortable conversation with you, because that is an uncomfortable conversation to have with somebody, to tell them that you are not meeting your ideal. You say that you want to do X, well, you're not doing X. You're not meeting your ideal of doing X. And we need to have that reminder. It's like you said, to those people that can keep us in check. And again, surrounding ourselves by that community, that right community that's going to help us nurture and blossom that and foster that environment that's going to lead us to naturally taking those right actions without the need for the negative stimulus. But nonetheless, they'll be there if the negative stimulus is necessary. Sometimes negative stimuli isn't bad, isn't the end of the world.
Most often it's not. It is very, it's an uncomfortable feeling that people want to avoid, but it is
exactly.
It is the negative, hurtful things that happen in life that can be the most impactful in changing who you are and growing you as a person. It's the whole yin yang system. You need to have feel bliss. You need to feel pain. You need to feel happy. You need to understand what it feels like to feel sad, and those polar opposites are necessary.
Yeah, and surrounding yourself by the right people. I think surrounding yourself but with the right community, they can help us stay in check, stay on the right path. When we begin to veer off, they can help us stay the course. They can shame us into it. Sometimes there's a negative stigma towards shame culture, but you know what? Hey, that might be an unpopular thought, but sometimes shaming people into the right things, that's a thing as well.
Yeah.
People don't like to talk about that, but it's true. It really is.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know if there's anything else we want to talk about for this episode. We touched on eco-anxiety, some of the positives of it, some of the positives, such as encouraging people to take action and responsibility and take control. Some of the negatives, such as the negative aspects of shaming, which again, we just said shaming isn't always bad, but, sometimes it can be bad, of course. Shaming people for traveling via airlines, should you feel bad for wanting to travel to Bali to experience their culture? I don't know. I wouldn't mind going to Thailand and checking out the beaches and, kicking it with the locals, swimming, getting some vitamin D. It's winter over here, so we could use some vitamin D. Excuse me for wanting some vitamin D. Go Schools.
Well, actually, one thing you just brought up there, is so the whole idea of shaming people becomes very problematic when you start to place it on just everything that we produce. Because I've seen this before. There was a video, I can't remember what exactly it was called. It was Life of Things, that perhaps was the title of it, but it basically broke down how like all these materials that we make, plastic, steel, all this is has this negative impact. And it also, what it did to some kids is, scare them about like getting Lego, getting any type of plastic consumable, and that in itself is toxic. I feel like that type of thinking is very toxic and it is so prevalent in environmental culture. I feel like because it's these what's prevalent is hyper focusing on individual things, whether it's air travel or plastic, and saying that they're evil and they're amoral, and using language that just really gets people feeling shameful about their own actions. When if you really look at those things individually, those are not the problems, and there are ways to have all these things in a lot of cases without worrying about them contributing to the environment negatively. And so be careful of the misinformation and shame culture that surrounds a lot of environmental topics is my word of advice.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point and good way to cap off the podcast. This was eco-anxiety. Let us know what you guys do to deal with your eco-anxiety. Do you think it's legit eco-anxiety? Is it some bullshit? I don't know. Let us know in the comments. If you like this video, please share it, do subscribe, hit the bell, and we'll catch you soon.
Peace.